You know what's interesting is there are no searches on this computer for Ambien, Paxil, Librium, there's paroxetine, Librium, Benadryl. No searches for divorce, right? That point's been made. Even though we know Julie Jensen was planning on getting a divorce. We heard that yesterday, that after the holidays, she'd be getting a divorce. Nothing like ethylene glycol or poisons or drug interactions were ever found on Mark's work computer. And this claim that he fried that computer is nonsense. They recovered that computer and they analyzed it. So, who was Julie Jensen? We heard from witnesses that Julie Jensen was a lovely human being. We heard from witnesses that she was a devoted mother. We have no reason to doubt either of those characteristics. But you can be lovely and you can be devoted to your kids and you can be mentally ill. And Julie Jensen was mentally ill. She had a major depressive disorder and was at high risk of suicide. Sometimes it's hard to put a finger on what we're supposed to believe about Julie Jensen. Was she meek and vulnerable? Did she need Mark's permission to discuss their kids' medical issues with a doctor? Was she constantly under the thumb of her husband, being controlled by whatever he wanted? Was she so naive that in 1998 on their second home computer that she didn't know how to turn one on? Did she need Mark to explain to her why she was feeling intoxicated on December 2nd? It sure doesn't seem that way. She was a straight A student. Chemistry, human physiology, death and dying, pharmacology, psych abnormal behavior, genetics. Those transcripts were admitted into evidence. She had her Series 7 brokerage license. She created a resume. After she had her own affair in the Jensen home with their 1-year-old in the house, she was the one who sent Perry Tarica packing and told him never to call or contact her anymore. That's not meek. We heard about her counseling in 1990 to 1991 with Paul DeFazio. She decided she wasn't happy with the progress. It wasn't going fast enough. And so she called and said she was going a different direction. That's not meek. When she fell in love with Perry Tarica, she got a lawyer and filed for divorce. She was in charge of the family finances. You've heard how she used Quicken on the computer. Her best friend, Laura Koster, the IT specialist. Laura Koster looked to her for how to use Quicken. Laura Koster confirmed that Julie Jensen used the computer and used the internet. When the private investigator, Dave Ellis, when he told her that the photos left at the house weren't her, she told him he was wrong. And she told him she didn't want his services anymore. When Perry Tarica sent her a letter with clipped out articles and cartoons, Julie Jensen called the police on him. Julie Jensen made decisions for herself. Now, the prosecution has advanced this theory that Julie Jensen was made to believe she'd lose the kids if they got divorced. I don't know where that claim comes from. She had a lawyer when she filed for divorce in 1991. She asked for full custody in that filing. According to Jill Polera, she was about to file for divorce again. Laura Koster said Julie didn't need Mark's permission and didn't need Mark to tell her what to do. Laura Koster would go to Julie Jensen with medical questions. But Julie Jensen did have some serious, long-standing mental health problems. And here is where I think the photos and the phone calls are actually relevant. We know that on June 29th, 1990, Mr. DeFazio, the psychotherapist, met with Julie Jensen. She had a new son. She'd been married for 6 years. He identified the possibility of limited postpartum depression. She described her mom's problem with alcoholism and said that there was a family history of depression. Mr. DeFazio testified that Julie Jensen was experiencing some obvious mental health issues. He diagnosed her as adult situational reactive with mixed features. He noted features of depression and anxiety. She told him she had a very unhappy childhood and was not happy whatsoever. Now, in July of 1990, she described getting little support from her spouse at home. In September of 1990, seasonal depression was noted. 2 weeks after that, they discussed an antidepressant and he referred her to a psychiatrist. She was prescribed Prozac. The psychiatrist, Dr. Newman, described her as crying all the time, having no appetite. She used to enjoy cooking, and now it's just a chore. Those are the notes. Chronically depressed, cries easily. Mr. DeFazio explained that with depression, things that used to give pleasure just don't anymore. Now, I mentioned in June of 1991, Julie Jensen canceled and said she wanted a different therapist, that progress wasn't going fast enough. She never told Mr. DeFazio about the affair. Mr. DeFazio made no referrals and did not know if she saw anyone else. Now, throughout this time are the hang-up calls and the issues with photos left at the house. I don't know what to make of the hang-up calls. Her log lists a lot of them. There's this narrative from the prosecution that it was Mark, and that when there'd be a trace, the calls would stop. We've heard that. It's false. We looked at the logs. We went through this. The vast majority of the hang-up calls were out of area. And in the 90s, I guess they couldn't trace those. The calls kept coming in while the traces were in effect. We've seen that in the logs. I went through those with Detective Ratsberg. Detective Ratsberg testified that out of area meant out of state. Mark's work phone was a 262 area code. The prosecution's argument that Mark was gaslighting Julie with hang-up calls, we know that because of the traces, is just simply false. The less than thorough investigation of Perry Tarica as being the source of the calls, they called and asked him and he said it wasn't him. Were these just normal hang-up calls? If they were, was this just more paranoia and perceived harassment? So what about these photos? Perhaps we can consider what evidence there actually is about these photos. What was actually described in all of those police reports to the house? The reported leaving of photos was sporadic. And Julie Jensen was convinced it was her in the photos. What Detective Ratsberg wrote, when I spoke with Julie last, she mentioned to me that she and Mark had sexual problems, and she stated that the photos, which normally showed her having contact with a man's penis, is something Mark wanted to do, but she refused. The photos were described as showing her. They were described by Julie Jensen as showing her. Now, Julie Jensen was a smart person and presumably would know if these pictures were of her. Now, despite testimony that there was a bag of evidence turned over and all the photos, all that was retained was a single photograph that by its description was unlike any of the others. This one was on actual photo paper. It had, I think, like a Kodak stamp on the back, and the picture looked nothing like Julie Jensen. Maybe the other ones didn't look anything like Julie Jensen, but the other ones were described as being on copy paper. These were never fingerprinted, although Detective Ratsburg acknowledged that they could have been. We heard from the secretaries that worked with Mark in 1998. They denied opening any mail that had pornographic pictures. But Detective Ratsburg confirmed that the only claims about getting photos in the mail at work were in the early 90s. Here's what else we know. They were all destroyed. So these pictures that Mark Jensen is accused of leaving around and sadistically torturing Julie Jensen with, there's no evidence for us to look at. Now, Mr. Jamboys asked Dr. West yesterday. He asked her this question. If Julie Jensen knew that she was being sadistically, psychologically tortured by Mark Jensen, would that suggest that her perceptions of reality in her stated fears were not distorted? First, Julie Jensen consistently denied everyone's suggestions that it might be Mark leaving the photos. She fired Dave Ellis, the investigator, when he made that suggestion. She insisted to Officer Kosman that they were her. So, if it was truly obvious that these pictures weren't of her, what does that say about her mental state that she just insisted that they were? Now, the next doctor reports that we have are Dr. Borman's. And he was her doctor from the mid-90s until Julie Jensen died. And she called about so many things. She called when Mark Jensen had washable marker on his face. She called if there was a cough in the family. You heard us go through these records. But in September of 1998, at that appointment, she brought up the family history of depression. She was concerned about her mom's history. She was tired. She had been prescribed Prozac before. Dr. Borman diagnosed her as having mild depression. At that visit, she weighed 123.5 pounds. In the fall, Laura Koster was talking with Julie Jensen outside while the kids played around them. And Julie showed Laura a photo of a list and a plastic syringe and asked her what she thought. And to Laura Koster, the person who knew her best and was her best friend, nothing seemed odd about what she was being shown. But what she noticed from this was the unsureness and the oddness of the question. And then Julie, while the kids were playing around them in the driveway, mentioned she thought Mark was going to kill her. And Laura Koster told her she didn't see it at all and was absolutely stunned by the suggestion. But she said, "If you feel you're in danger, come with me and we'll make sure you're safe." Laura Koster knew Julie Jensen better than anyone, and she said that Julie Jensen wasn't scared. She said Julie Jensen, in that conversation, had extraordinarily flat emotion for the topic of that conversation. You heard about on November 29th, there's a search for antifreeze. And then on November 30th, Julie was at karate practice and talked with Laura Koster again. This is the week that Douglas was starting full-time daycare. And Julie said she'd be going to see a doctor and be treated for depression. That she was going to see a doctor that week and be treated for depression. And then she said she wasn't going to be at karate for the next few days or at the next time. She said Laura wouldn't be seeing her for a few days. Laura described her as unusually emotive, that Julie Jensen hugged her and it was like a goodbye. And then Dr. Borman saw her on December 1st, 1998. He fit her in. She was alone at that appointment. Dr. Borman explained that Julie really didn't want to be labeled as crazy. She was miserable. She was depressed. She had decreased appetite. She had lost nearly 7% of her body weight from the previous visit. She denied any issues of domestic violence. She was distraught and in tears. She declined counseling. She denied being suicidal. She denied being homicidal. Dr. Borman had never seen her like this. On December 2nd, Mark Jensen came and expressed his concern about Julie's sleep issues, and Dr. Borman gave him a prescription for some Ambien. Now, the prosecution seems incredulous that Dr. West thought that the prescription of Ambien was not based solely on the word of Mark Jensen. She opined it was necessarily filtered through the information from Julie Jensen the day before and previous visits which suggested major depression. I mean, we can look to the September visit where being tired, fatigue was noted. I want to talk about Julie Jensen's perceptions of reality. And I want to consider the wildly inconsistent statements of her. To Therese DeFazio, Mark wouldn't let her get a job. He was controlling. To the Voights, Mark is pushing her to get a job, and she doesn't want to. To Ann Lynch, she has to get a job because her marriage is in the toilet. To Laura Shore, she was actually offered a job and had a start date when she hadn't been offered a job and didn't have a start date. To Therese DeFazio, Mark always turned off the computer or covered it quickly. To the Voights, she'd walk past the computer screen and see poison on the screen. Mark would leave for work, and on the computer screen was a website for poison. I mean, I want to go through all of these, but on that one, right, like we heard about dial-up internet, and we heard about when these searches were. And so was the computer just logged on onto this website for 9-10 hours? To Ann Lynch, she said nothing about the computer. to Therese DeFazio. She wanted to put Douglas in all-day school, which is a special program for normal kids to mentor kids with special needs. To the Voights, Mark is making her put Douglas in daycare and she doesn't want to. To Ann Lynch, she was upset and crying about needing to put Douglas in daycare full-time and wanted to know if they had space. All of these statements are basically contemporaneous with each other. That Post-it note that we keep hearing about, where did it go? Julie was the one that took a picture of it. In the moment, the people that she showed it to, the people that knew Julie Jensen, who knew the context, who knew what her complaints and concerns were, they looked at that Post-it note, and how did they react? They thought it meant nothing. Think about some of Ted Voight's testimony in this case. Evidently, he thought that Mark Jensen had killed Julie Jensen. And then when he was asked to describe that office, he didn't recognize it. I don't know if you remember this from the video. He didn't recognize it because when he had been in that office, later, things had been moved around. He was in that office after Julie Jensen had died, sitting there with Mark while Mark was helping him with stocks. So this neighbor who thinks that Mark Jensen was out to get Julie Jensen is then over there getting stock trading help from Mark Jensen in that office. You know, the thing about that, leaving the computer on so that when Julie would be vacuuming or walk by and she would see what was on and the door would be 3/4 closed. We saw a picture of that room. And we talked about this, I think it was when Detective Ratzberg was testifying about the scene photos. And we saw a picture of that room and the location of the computer and where the door was and how the door closed. And if that door was 3/4 closed, no one would be able to see the computer screen. That list, that Post-it note, that's such a big deal. It says DeFazio, Terry on it. Well, how does that play? How does Therese DeFazio play into this scheme of Mark Jensen's? It said Nicotrol. Didn't the state say that that was prescribed to Mark? Is this like all the other lists that got talked about, and what does this mean? What do these letters mean? And then we learned from Dave Naring that they were stock symbols. And here we are, 25 years later, trying to assign meaning to these little nuggets of information when we know the meaning of these nuggets of information because the people who lived in that moment and knew her the best looked at it, and we know how they reacted to it. I want to talk about the offers of help that Julie Jensen received and declined. Ted Voight offered to give Julie money and she could use his cabin, and Julie declined the offer. Therese DeFazio offered to set up Julie with a women's shelter. Julie declined and said her neighbor was working on getting her a place. But when that happened, she had already declined Ted Voight's offer. Laura Koster offered to give Julie a place to stay with the boys and not allow Mark at the residence if Julie was actually concerned. She also said, your brother lives a couple of miles away. Take the checkbook and the boys and leave. Julie didn't call her brother. She didn't leave with the boys. She didn't take the money. She had her own car. Officer Kosman said, if this is real, go to the shelter if your life is in danger. She declined. You know, the state's wrong. We aren't suggesting that Julie Jensen was framing Mark Jensen with these statements about fear. These were paranoid misperceptions of reality. One of the things that Dr. West explained to us yesterday is she said that a person at high risk of suicide creates space for themselves to be able to follow through. She said she sees that in suicide cases. Julie Jensen created that space for herself. Her conversation with her best friend, Laura Koster, on November 30th. You're not going to see me for a few days. On December 2nd, she wrote the note to Therese DeFazio that she wouldn't be seeing her. Her conversation with Margaret Voigt on December 2nd. You won't be seeing me, don't worry, I'm fine. I want to take a look at the last 2 weeks of her December calendar. Well, actually, yeah, if you go back, these are some calendar pages in November. And they're full of things. And then when we go to some pages in December, there's nothing. Julie Jensen was aware of what she was doing. She was creating space for herself, like Dr. West described. Now the science, we didn't learn about the science and how ethylene glycol poisoning works from the prosecution. We learned that from Dr. Hale. And the blood levels tell us nothing about whether something is a homicide or a suicide. Dr. Mainland thought it's a homicide because it's hard to get someone to drink a fatal dose, and so it would have to be multiple lower doses. But then we learned that this little NyQuil shot was all that would be needed for it to be a fatal dose. And then there's nothing in Julie Jensen's toxicology that suggests this was anything more than a single fatal dose on the night of December 1st to the early morning of December 2nd. Now, the person educated in pharmacology who Laura Koster went to with questions about medicine, she didn't need Mark to explain side effects of Paxil or paroxetine. We learned about a person's mental faculties and their abilities while processing ethylene glycol. We learned about what Julie Jensen, the person educated in pharmacology, informed her neighbor on December 2nd that she was fine, it was her new meds, and Mark was going to the doctor for her. She knew that Mark Jensen was going to Dr. Borman's for her. Now that doesn't really fit with this idea that he's got this scheme and he's involuntarily administering medications and she doesn't know what they're for, and he's forcing her to take these things and he's drugging her against her will. We learned about the high likelihood that the half a teaspoon remnant of ethylene glycol in her stomach was just that, a remnant of a prior dose. We also heard from Dr. Mainland's extraordinarily questionable study. But the blood levels tell you nothing. But you know what was interesting about her study? Is that almost every ethylene glycol case that she could find was a suicide. That's sad, and it's what happened here. Mark Jensen did not kill his wife. We know this from the science. We know this from what Julie Jensen told her physician. We know this from what from when Julie Jensen said goodbye to Laura Koster. We know this from the description of David Jensen and how distraught and grief-stricken his dad was. Now, the prosecution has one more chance to get up for an argument. They'll have their rebuttal argument. I'm not going to have a chance to answer that. So this will be the last you hear from me in this case. Please think about the questions we've asked of the witnesses in this case. Please think about what my answer would be to the state's argument. This case is tragic on so many levels. There's depression, there's suicide, and there's an innocent man on trial for homicide. Mark Jensen is innocent, and we ask you to return a verdict of not guilty.